listeners. My name is Isabella Tassini. I am the program intern at AIIA Victoria. A very warm welcome to our live audience in Dyson House, including another fellow of the Institute here today, Tony Wheeler, and to our online audience. To launch his new book, Reflections on a United Nations Career, it is a pleasure to welcome Professor Ian Howie. Ian Howie is an associate professor at the Nossal Institute for Global Health, the University of Melbourne, and adjunct professor at RMIT University. He has spent more than 35 years working in the field of international development. The bulk of this time was spent with the United Nations as a career official in Rwanda, North Korea, China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and more. He also spent 7 years at the UN headquarters in New York, following his appointment as the chief of the Division of Human Resources. He also has a close connection with the AIIA, having served on our council from 2009 to 2015. His interlocutor, Tony Walker, is a Vice Chancellor's Fellow at La Trobe University. In 2022, he was awarded an AM for significant service to the media as a journalist and to the community. He is a columnist for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, and a dual Walkley Award winner for commentary and recipient of the Paul Lynham Award for his excellence in press gallery journalism. He was made a fellow of the AIIA in 2013. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. We are going to do it this way. I'll make some introductory remarks and then ask Ian some questions, and then open questions to the floor. So perhaps you can think of some questions to ask so that you don't have to put up with me more than necessary. Thank you very much for asking me to do this. It's nice to be here, and it's nice to see some familiar faces. Michael, Zara, Barry, all the way from South Australia, the great state of South Australia. And I'm sure there are others here. My eyesight was better that I would recognize. It's a great pleasure, Ian, to do this event with you. We did a preliminary event at Readings the other evening, launching your book, and we had a good turn-up, I have to say. And we're going to pursue a similar format this evening. And I'm not sure how many people are watching via Zoom, but please feel free to ask questions as well and take a bit of pressure off me. We're here to launch, or to discuss actually, Ian Howie's book, Reflections on a United Nations Career, which tells the story of his more than 30 years with the UN Population Fund. This is a personal story, actually an extraordinary personal story. And the other evening I said at this book launch at Readings that it suggests the 3 P's and 2 R's. Patience, perseverance, and persistence, and the R's, resourcefulness and resilience. I have to say, on reading the book of Ian's personal experiences in his 30 years with the UN, it is an extraordinary story of a personal commitment to that institution. And just to mention the phrase, Ian's phrase that crops up throughout the book, he uses this phrase, learning by doing, which I think you mean learning on the job, or getting on with the job despite or in spite of rather opaque bureaucracy which you are having to deal with. So you did a lot of learning by doing, I have to say. Ian has skillfully combined his personal experiences, his own personal experiences, with the challenges facing the UN. And I think one of the nice things about the book was that you were able to weave together your own personal story and the story of your professional life at the UN, which gave it more meaning, I think, in a way. It's not a dry account of an international bureaucrat's life. I hope you don't mind being referred to as an international bureaucrat. You know, we'll have questions, and I'll ask you a question. Others may well have questions along these lines, we'll ask you about the UN's effectiveness at this moment in our history. And of course, we're all thinking about what's going on in Ukraine and the UN's apparent inability to do much about it, quite frankly. So Ian's remarkable personal story of his work, learning by doing, or put another way, learning on the job, in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Ghana, China, the DPRK, Vietnam, and Rwanda, and back at UN headquarters in New York, reminds us, or should remind us, that the UN's work is much more than ineffectual meetings on the Security Council. I have to say we've seen plenty of posturing during the Security Council debates about the Ukraine situation. We've seen the Russian representative give new meaning to the definition of a diplomat, someone sent abroad for their country to lie. The original quote is, a good man, not a woman, but we can add that, sent abroad to lie for their country. I don't think I've ever witnessed such a blatant mistruth from a public representative in my life. Ian, I should say, of all your assignments that I found most absorbing from a personal standpoint was your time in China. I suppose that was the most testing politically. We'll ask questions about that. Politically, because the one-child policy, of course, was such a sensitive issue politically from the point of view of the UN itself, and of course, donor countries like the United States, where the one-child policy met some resistance, I think it's fair to say. Also, when you read the book, I thought your first assignment in Bangladesh was highly revealing of the challenges facing anyone working in the field for a UN agency. I think it's probably fair to say, Ian, that when you got there, you weren't entirely sure what you were expected to do. The fact that you made the best of the situation, I think reflects very well on you, but we'll come to questions about that. I should mention here that Ian and I coincided in China, but we never met. Two tall Australians lived in the same, I'm not sure who's taller, but we had two tall Australians from Melbourne, actually.
And we lived in the same compound.
And well, my office was in your compound, in the Jiangwai compound. I lived in the Chijiayuan compound on the other side of the friendship store, the Yoi Shangdian. But a relatively small Australian community in those days, but our paths never crossed for some reason. 1992? No, we're talking about 93 to 98. And I think we were there for quite some time.
5 years, yeah.
5 years, and for some reason, I was not always, I should tell you, not always persona grata at the Australian Embassy, which might have something to do. I think as correspondents, we were very much aware of the One China policy's shortcomings and challenges. The forced abortions, of course, the infanticide to weed out female births, and the resulting imbalance between males and females. And one of the questions that I think we'd like to hear you on is the challenge of the aging population in China. Of course, one of the major challenges that it had. Finally, I should say, before we go to questions, I should say that Ian's book deals a lot with and revealingly with the UN bureaucracy. And I think you told me you were there in New York for 9 years? 7, sorry, forgive me. Well, it was quite a long stint. And clearly you needed to fall back a lot on the 3 Ps and the 2 Rs when you were working in the UN. So let's start with the questions. How did a Melbourne boy educated at Wesley?
Correct.
Wesley Methodist College, is that what they call it? And Melbourne University?
Yes, and Sydney University.
And Sydney, so find himself working for the UN or one of its agencies. This is the why question. Why did you choose this career path, or did it choose you?
Well, thank you, Tony. And I should begin by congratulating you on your honour at the Australia Day honours this year. So,
well, I hope no one would notice, but anyway.
Yes. Well, your years of
I can see
contributions
Zara saying false modesty. I've got a few stories that I can tell about that.
to Australian journalism was recognised. Well, how did I join the U? I suppose a number of factors give rise to that. And like many people here today and listening, I mean, in your life, you come to a T intersection, you go left, you go right, you make a decision which has an impact on the future career path or lifestyle you adopted. For me, a number of contributing factors. As I recount in the early chapters of the book, I was an exchange student whilst a schoolboy, and I went to Fort Worth, Texas, which is twin city now virtually of Dallas. I spent a year there as an international exchange student. And for an impressionable schoolboy, as I was at that time, that obviously had a big impact on me. And not least, of course, I happened through pure coincidence to be present at what subsequently is a monumental event in modern American life. Namely, I went to the breakfast given for President Kennedy in Fort Worth, Texas on the day he was shot. And from Fort Worth, he went to Dallas, and going into Dallas was when he was assassinated. So I had a rendezvous with history there, and little did I know that I had another rendezvous with history fast forward to 9/11, when it fell to me to evacuate the UN building in New York on that day. So I bookend my book with those two sort of global experiences. But back to your question, yes, being an international exchange student, although it never occurred to me at the time, was obviously a major issue in charting the road I would take in my life. I wanted to work in development. I opted to, after I finished at Sydney University, to go as a volunteer, initially to Fiji and then to Papua New Guinea. And that fork in the road I gave a reference to happened when I was an advisor to a minister. There was an international conference. I had written a speech for my minister. He was unable to deliver it. I had to deliver my own speech. And when the conference broke after the opening ceremony and people were gathered for morning tea, someone came up to me and said, "I'm from the International Labour Organization. We're looking for someone to pilot a project in rural Bangladesh. Would you be interested?" And that's how I started. I went on a one-year contract to rural Bangladesh. Did I know anything about Bangladesh? No. Had I ever? How old was I? I was in mid-20s. Had I ever, as I say, been to Bangladesh? No. Did I speak Bengali? No. I was going to work at village level on rural development. Had I ever worked in that area? No. But I was keen, I was motivated, and I was idealistic. And off I went to rural Bangladesh for 1 year, which subsequently, in 2012, although, you know, I am an Australian, but I had nothing to do with the Australian government. I'm a career UN staff member. And the last assignment, I had a special assignment for the Secretary General in Rwanda, for which I've had a long-term interest.
Was there any religious component in your education or family background?
That's again, what does motivate people to commitment to development and so on, to community service? Yes, I went to Wesley, that's well known. At Wesley at that time was a Methodist school, now a Uniting Church school, or even though it may have severed its connection with the Uniting Church. But Wesley, the whole tradition of Methodism talks about certain talks about a commitment. And I'm sure that was a contributing factor that saw me go in the direction I had. But I was the only one in my family who chose such a lifestyle. I didn't go into the law like my brothers. How could I do that? There was no room for two brothers.
Much to my parents' disappointment, I went into journalism. But anyway, that's another question, another issue. Right throughout the book, you write, I think it's fair to say, fairly critically about the UN as an institution, more in sorrow than in anger.
Yes,
I think it's fair to say, but I mean, the obvious question is, why did you persevere?
I think that's a very fair point. Even having written the book, in the book I've endeavored to say how it was, how I saw it, how it impacted on me, how it impacted on my family. The truth is neither black or white, it's a grey, and I accept it. It's a subjective viewpoint, but I wanted to tell the reader, because people are constantly asking, particularly students, how did you join? What was it like? What worked? Do you feel you made a difference? If not, why not? How did you cover moving from country to country? What impact did it have on your children? Changing school, your wife, and you're absolutely dependent on your family in this respect. And what I also should point out, Tony, this is not like the Australian diplomatic corps or most diplomatic corps. You don't start off in Canberra, do a few years, and then a posting as a third secretary, and then back to Canberra, and then another posting somewhere, moving back and forth. So there's some continuity. In the UN system, you simply go from country to country. And many people are unaware also that when they think of the UN, they naturally think of the Security Council, the General Assembly, that iconic building on the East River. But most people in the UN work for the funds, the agencies, and the programs. They're delivering the development role of the UN. And you have many of these. You have UN Development Program, UNDP. You have the two big funds, UNICEF, the UN International Children's Emergency Fund, the UN Population Fund. And then you have the specialized agencies like the ILO, the World Health Organization, UNESCO. There's 38 of them, and they're headquartered in Paris, in Rome, in Geneva, in London. There's only one in a developing country, and that's the Environment Program, which is in Nairobi. When I joined the ILO, I didn't know any of that, to be honest. I knew the ILO was one of the few survivors from the League of Nations. It was founded in 1919. But you have other parts of the UN system, like the Postal Union or the patents part of it. They're founded in the 1880s. They're all survivors from the League, which have now been subsumed by the UN. But most of the UN agencies are all relatively new. The most new of which is UN Women. It's the most recent one to be established. That tells you something, doesn't it, about priorities of the UN? And of course,
maybe we'll be UN men one day.
Indeed, indeed. But they're all working in development here. There's enormous overlap. There's competition. And that's part of its success, but it's also part of the challenge. There's too many.
Does it trouble you that criticism of the UN these days tends to be politicized? We hear the word globalism, for example, which is a sort of catch-all word to criticize multilateral institutions that somehow are eating away at the power of nation states. I think that's the argument. So what would be the response to that?
Well, when you consider all those funds and agencies and programs, staffing those organizations are representatives from 193 countries that make up the UN. Now, that's an extraordinary situation. And just as an aside, there may be 194 soon if Bougainville votes to secede from Papua New Guinea, will be the 194th one. So you're working in a unique situation here with representatives from all those countries. The UN has no political agenda. I mean, I covered North Korea for a long period of time during the famine there, and we did important work in difficult circumstances. The North Koreans trusted us because we had no agenda, and they allowed us to travel freely around the country, which you simply couldn't do if you were from a bilateral organization or an embassy. So the UN brings in that aspect of its work, and also it can talk directly to government, to ministers. It can talk policy, which is quite difficult for an embassy to do so. And of course, the broader question about aid and does it make a difference and what's the critical factor of aid and so on. And certainly in my Africa postings, particularly where I was focused on, for example, maternal child health, creating the conditions whereby women don't die giving birth, a very basic undertaking. Now that varied quite markedly from China, where I was in a very political role, because I was negotiating human rights, how to have the Chinese modify their one-child policy, which is so ironic, is now a three-child policy. I mean, who would have thought in China, where they held so vehemently for so many years to one child, although interestingly enough, they were warned about the one-child policy in the 70s by Chinese demographers, that this was not the way to go. But Mao persisted, he was persuaded, and now the ramifications of that sees an aging population, diminishing workforce.
I guess as a correspondent, over 10 years, I should tell you, in China on 2 separate occasions, I accepted that they had to do something about the population explosion that occurred during the 60s, when families were encouraged to have more children. I mean, at the beginning of the revolution or the Mao period, families were encouraged to have more children. So
yes, Mao said poverty was the issue, not population.
Yeah. So I must say that you know, I was never sure where the tipping point was or should be as far as their population policies were concerned, because the country would have been overwhelmed, wouldn't it?
Well, it's interesting.
If it had continued to let it rip.
Yeah. China, the Chinese would say, and I'm sure this audience would understand it, that, as I say in the book, if you want boatloads of refugees sailing up the Hudson into New York, we all want to have as many children as we would like to have, but we have to be socially responsible, not only to our country, but to the world. And that's why we have the policy that we have. They're not the only country that has a policy. The North Koreans have a 2-child policy. Vietnam has a 2-child policy all through that era, which is basically the same way in terms of enforcement.
Brings us to the question about China's aging population, and you're suggesting that they somehow got the formula wrong, that the one-child policy was too strict.
Oh, yeah.
So what are the implications of that, Ian, of the aging population issue? I mean, if you could just give us a sense of that.
Well, firstly, if you use the word stringency, it's an interesting comment, the China Family Planning Program, because it also tells you something about the power of bureaucracy. There were 500,000 staff members in the State Family Planning Commission. There are 2 million members of the China Family Planning Association. So this powerful bureaucracy had a vested interest in maintaining the crisis of population growth. And even though the country was being warned that you have an aging population and diminished workforce, that bureaucracy was sufficiently powerful not to see any modification of the policy. Although they did allow you, contrary during our negotiations, not to dictate when you could have it, because that was dictated. You're encouraged to have your first child in your 4th year of marriage. And if that was a girl, you could apply to have a 2nd child in your 8th year of marriage. But that was if you were a farmer. If you were an urban dweller, a Han Chinese, you were only allowed to have one child, but you could, if you're a farmer, you could have two. But that's all changed now, and you have an aging workforce. Yes, and the retirement age for women is 55, and there's now a push to raise that. If you've worked for the government, you have a pension, but pension is not readily available. There's a massive movement from rural to urban, which also puts pressure on the cities and on accommodation. And of course, the residue of the one-child policy is you have so many more boys than girls. Estimates about 80 million more boys than girls. How do you get wives? So during my time in Vietnam, every year 20,000 Vietnamese women were going as arranged marriages, but they're all going to South Korea, Vietnamese women, and to Malaysia. I mean, this is a reality that many people are not aware of. But that's peculiar when I talk about China and Vietnam to the work there. If you talk about the work we were doing in Rwanda, it's a completely different dynamic. There you're working in the camps across the border in the Congo. And you're just trying to provide some basic care for people living in appalling conditions. The diametric opposite of the realities of China and Vietnam.
Could I ask a general question about the UN? There's a lot of talk about reform, and it doesn't ever seem to come to much. If you had your way, and from your long experience, what sort of basic reforms would you propose to the functioning of the UN?
Well, I would go back to the first reform initiative for the UN, which was outlined by a very eminent Melburnian, whose name is Sir Robert Jackson. And he was appointed in the 60s to write a work at the request of the Secretary General on how to reform the UN. And when Kofi Annan in his second term was under immense pressure over the Oil for Food program, which you may remember in the Australian Wheat Board was implicated that, and he said at one stage, "Where is Jacko when I need him?" Who is Jacko? I asked myself. This is Sir Robert Jackson. And he was the go-to person on UN reform. Interestingly enough, the go-to person on UN reform today, the Under-Secretary General, is also an Australian. And he's in New York working on reform. Although, disappointingly, with the Ukraine situation, reform and the Sustainable Development Goals, the initiative of the current Secretary General, was somewhat put to the back step. It's off the agenda a bit. So what would we do? Well, there's just too many agencies. There's too much overlap. There's too much repetition. Let me give you a simple illustration. The Minister for Health, let me just pick Ghana, where I serve. The World Health Organization representative would have an appointment at 9 o'clock to discuss maternal mortality, for example. The UNICEF person would come up 10 o'clock to discuss maternal mortality. The representative of the European Union would be there at 11 o'clock to discuss maternal mortality. The USAID representative would be having lunch, and you get the point I'm making. I mean, and then of course you've got the big player now. When Warren Buff, the investor, gave his foundation funds to Bill and Melinda Gates, we're talking about an organization that's $80 billion. And there's just a powerful player in the whole development effort. And they're doing maternal mortality as well. So the UN needs to be working out of program issues for the reasons I said earlier. They need to encapsulate what works and talk to government in a policy sense. And We need to cut down the number of agencies. We need, as we tried in Vietnam, to have one UN, to have a UN ambassador. And according to the priorities of the country, you would have a number of deputy ambassadors. One might be, if the country says, well, primary health care is issue, the WHO person. If the country says it's how to deal with agricultural issues, you'd have the World Food and Agricultural Organization, but you just have far fewer. When you're working in social change, in behavioural change, of course, it takes longer. It's very easy for an aid organisation to provide equipment, to build bridges, to provide cars and so on. But when you're working on social change, changing people's behaviour, like literacy programs, nutrition programs, it takes much longer. You need to be there longer. And you need just those agencies with those specializations there.
I mean, I think it probably sounds to all of us, or seems to all of us, that it doesn't do the UN, such a great job at marketing its contribution to the global community. It doesn't do a great job explaining what it is all about.
My own organisation, in a sense, despite itself, often found itself at the apex of controversy. I work for the Population Fund. The Population Fund works in the area of reproductive health and maternal health. But in the US, abortion is such a hot button issue that every time the Republicans come to power, they cut the funding to the UN Population Fund, they cut the funding to WHO, and they cut the funding to UNICEF. The Democrats come to power, they restore the funding. Literally, Obama did it in the 4th day of his presidency, just as Biden has done. And so this pendulum has just been going on since Reagan's day. And this is such a hot button issue in the US. The UN is not permitted to support abortion. Yet we're constantly being accused of being associated with promoting abortion. And when you're in a country like Vietnam or China that have these policies, we're constantly being criticized. And so we have in the public eye for those very reasons. When there's a crisis, the UN comes to the fore because they do humanitarian work incredibly well.
Speaking of crisis, with the Ukraine situation, it seems, this is not a criticism, it's an observation, but it seems to have been particularly ineffectual. Now, what's the fair judgment, do you think? And it's a subsidiary question. Should Russia be suspended or have its membership of the Security Council withdrawn? I guess that's virtually impossible given the way the numbers would stack up. But should there be some punitive action taken against Russia at the UN?
Well, as Churchill said, we need more, what did he say? More jaw and less war. A colloquialism of his. Yes, Russia will never be removed from the UN. People have got to recall that at the San Francisco in 1945, where Dr. Everett played such a critical role on behalf of Australia and the middle income nations, the great powers at that time, the victors in the Second World War, were really only interested in the Security Council, and they were only interested in the veto. And the 5 permanent members were given the veto power. And that's how it is to this day. The 10 elected members that make up the Security Council, that changes every 2 years, endeavour to accommodate the interests of those great powers. And over the history of the UN, there have been regular calls for removing the country. It will never happen.
Or the increase.
And nor should it happen, in my view.
Increase in the size of the Security Council. Sorry, excuse me.
Yes, well, I think that the 5 members doesn't include India, doesn't include Brazil, doesn't include Japan, doesn't include Nigeria, doesn't include South Africa. I mean, these are countries that clearly should be on an equal status, one would have assumed, within a UN context. But it's difficult to see how that will happen. And over time, in the development work of the UN, other organizations have been built up to sort of support the UN in that area. But the Ukraine highlights both the strengths and the weaknesses of the UN. I mean, it's only as good as the 193 members are. Yes, 140 voted or thereabouts for that resolution condemning Russia. But a number of countries abstained, including India abstained, which when people thought about it, that wasn't so surprising, but that's a key abstention, and other countries abstained, and a very small number voted.
Our quad partner, it might be pointed out. Can I ask you a personal question? You write quite a lot in the book about adopting a daughter, I think, in Bangladesh before you had your own family or your own child. I wonder what prompted that. I found it, I mean, not surprising, but an interesting thing to do. Just wonder what prompted that.
Yes, yes. Well, I had a strong commitment that had come through my education, my interest in development, my wanting to go as a volunteer in a developing country. I had a strong commitment that for the number of children I might have, I would adopt the same number. And when I was in Bangladesh, the opportunity came about to do that. On arrival in Bangladesh, I got immediately involved in mitigating an appalling cholera outbreak they ever had in Bangladesh, and people were literally dying everywhere. A 2-week-old baby who was in a chronic condition in an orphanage which I was visiting is now a 45-year-old and lives in Glen Iris with 2 children and a husband, and I was having dinner there last night. So there we are. Yes, that was a commitment.
That speaks very well of you, I have to say.
That I had, because I was the lucky one in that situation. Many people might think the opposite, but I've never thought otherwise, that I was the lucky one.
Before we go to questions from the floor, there's one last question, because I've seen from my watch we're 40 minutes in. Of all the Secretaries General that you worked under, who impressed you most and why?
Yeah, that's easy for me to answer. Coffee, in part because I worked in Ghana, and Coffee was from Ghana. And also he came from within the system. He wasn't an outsider to the system, so he knew it. And he was just the nicest man, really. And because I worked in the area of population, and particularly in primary healthcare and reproductive health, it always felt to me when a Secretary General would visit, well, you work in that area, so the wife, you look after the wife of the Secretary General. Isn't that a comment in itself, you know? So I got to know the wives of the Secretary General, as well as I got to know the Secretary General, and Coffee had a lovely wife too. But yes, Coffee. And he made a genuine effort to reform the system, but it's very difficult to reform. But yes.
Well, we'll have questions from the floor. Ask whatever you like. I mean, you can ask Ian for the cash rate or the unemployment rate. I'm sure he'll be able to answer them. Sorry, forgive me. I don't know whether we have a system here where people identify themselves? Is that regarded as appropriate? Yeah.
Thank you for a very lively presentation. Thank you to both of you. And congratulations on your award, Tony. Thank you for relating your experiences, Professor. I think your experience of being actually given your first assignment seems to only happen to guys. But anyway, that's an aside, like in terms of just someone coming to somebody, just giving them an assignment that in an area. I heard Tony say that you were also an HR person at the UN. Within your time, has there been any changes to that sort of induction or recruitment of candidates for jobs at the UN? Because I've watched a recent movie, a very, very impressive movie about what happened at Bosnia, but the UN peacekeepers over there were depicted in that manner. Very, very young people who didn't seem to have what they were into, and they had no idea where, like, has it changed a lot or is it still the same?
Yeah, well, I'm familiar with peacekeepers in Bosnia, particularly the Dutch peacekeepers who have, and the Dutch Prime Minister has just apologized for their failings just within the last month. Now, peacekeepers are a different situation in the UN context. And Australia military and Australian police have played a big role in peacekeeping, really from the very beginning. In the 40s, they went into Greece. That was the first UN peacekeeping mission, was in Greece after the Second World War. Far fewer Australians are going into peacekeeping now. Peacekeeping is a difficult situation because you're traditionally in a non-conflict role, or even though that's changing now. But I saw most of the peacekeepers in the Congo when I was covering it from Rwanda. And the peacekeeping force there came from, they were Uruguayan peacekeepers, funnily enough, that I saw there, who were doing the best they could in very difficult circumstances. So peacekeepers have a mixed role. And the Australian military who went to Rwanda and into the Congo have written extensively about what they were trying to do in difficult, very, very difficult circumstances. Will we ever have a peacekeeping role in the Ukraine? I don't know. It's hard to see. There have been successes in peacekeeping, particularly in West Africa. In Cambodia, there were successes, but they failed terribly in Rwanda. And that was very much leveled at Kofi Annan because he was in charge of peacekeeping at that time. And he was in charge of peacekeeping when they reduced the peacekeepers just before the genocide happened. And that was a contributing factor when they were under the direction of a very famous Canadian general. And it so impacted on him. Well, it's worth reading his story. And when the Security Council cut the number of peacekeepers in Rwanda, the perpetrators of the genocide took that as they had the carte blanche to go ahead, and they did. And the massacres began over a 3-month period. So, I mean, NATO used peacekeepers. Was it NATO in Bosnia in the Serbian conflict? Did that come under NATO, or I think it came under NATO? Oh, I beg your pardon. Back to your question. Yes, I went as charge of human resources. I'd never worked in the area in my life, just like everything else. But you learn on the job. You're recruiting people from around the world. You have standard recruitment procedures like any other larger organization. We I dissolved in that capacity permanency. So you can no longer get a permanent job. You used to get a permanent job in the Australian public service too. You now work on a contractual arrangement. People are assessed according to contemporary assessment processes. I mean, we have pages and pages of guidelines for HR protocols. I mean, it's a standard, what you would imagine whether you're working for any large multinational organization in terms of their recruitment. That doesn't stop though. Ambassadors coming to see you and say, would you consider jobs for my children? And here I'm talking about a local ambassador. So let's not think it's something that happens elsewhere. But also the Dutch, for example, from their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they had a staff member who would come and see me every 6 months, would go through every Dutch member working in New York in the UN system and say, this one applied for a promotion, this one applied for a posting. Everyone they would go through, and you would have to answer them as to what happened. So the Australian government refused to operate that way unless you were very senior and were offering to be the head of an agency. And the Australians have an ambassador to the UN, incidentally.
Another question. Yes. The young lady, oh, sorry, Zara?
Sorry,
The
Zara
young lady
Kimpton.
here.
Young lady, I'm Zara Kimpton, National Vice President. And my question is actually very similar, with a slight difference. You said in the UN system, you go from country to country. Most people who work for the UN are in development roles. And then you made Rwanda was so different to Asia. So what I want to know is when people, the UN people go in, how much are they actually bringing in just foreigners, outsiders to countries who might have Western values, different values? How much are you actually really liaising with the country in question? And how are you having personnel who are experts in African problems compared with Asian problems or others around the world?
Yeah, that's a very, very, very fair question to ask. You can't work in your home country to start with. I'll make that point. As I've said, there's 193 member nations and staff from 193. So most of our staff in Africa, and you have national staff working in country to start with, and you have international staff who are rotated. So in Africa, of course, we have large numbers of Francophone staff who come from Francophone Africa, Anglophone staff, and Portuguese speakers. So, but you know, you'll have an Angolan who might be in Burkina Faso or in Mozambique, where Portuguese is spoken. And of course, you'll have the French working in Francophone Africa. But also the UN says that if national staff, of course, can apply to become international staff and have to go through the selection criteria. But international staff over time build up expertise. Over time, you become more a manager than a specialist in a given area. So you're running programs in countries, and that's a skill which I think is transferable. It's not necessarily peculiar to one country, but you're recruiting the expertise. So in Vietnam, for example, in my 5 years there, I'm bringing in, well, Vietnam has enough experts in its own right, so I'm using the Vietnamese. I'm engaging them as consultants for particular tasks for us. Or the Australian Bureau of Stats have been underpinning the census in Vietnam for years, from the very beginning, and they do a superb job. And now the Vietnamese are perfectly able to run their own census because of that Bureau of Statistics support they've had over the years. So it's a combination of local staff, local consultants, and international expertise.
Do we have a Zoom question, Alistair? Yeah, or yeah.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for the presentation. So and for your nice comment that the UN do humanitarian work very well. So I've worked for the UN in humanitarian areas, but also development. But I'm more a technical specialist, so I quite like the first two questions.
Yes, indeed.
With regard to frontline teams and the efficiencies. In fact, I'm doing a PhD now, developing a guide to support those frontline teams to actually capture that knowledge and particularly support national, individuals. My two questions, well, let's say one, but in two parts. I am interested in your area of study, something actually got you to become the advisor for that, for the countries, but also for all the different funds. So my experience is with UNICEF. But I'm interested in all the 38 different funds that are in the UN, if you can make some comment about which one had the most effective internal systems to support field implementation.
That's a challenging
Just a modest question. Thousands of people applied to join the UN, which in part explains why I wrote the book, so they could get some idea. For any position in the UN, you have to have a master's degree. So the system will automatically, when you put in your application online, you've got a master's degree, end of story. Now, what that master's degree is in is not a big factor in a sense, but you have to have a master's degree. There's 6 official UN languages: English, French, Spanish, Russian, Mandarin, and Arabic. Now, all the Europeans speak 2 of those, at least. All the Africans will speak 2 of those. The South Americans will all speak 2 of those. Australians, maybe, maybe not. Asians, less so. People from the Indian subcontinent might speak half a dozen languages, but Hindi is not a UN language, nor is Bengali. So that has some weighting. And this is particularly for people who are going in at the junior level. Now, a very welcome development here in Australia is they have just reintroduced the Junior Professional Officer Program, the JPO program. And that, we were out of that for years, but it's just come back in the last year. And that is whereby a government pays for young people, 25 to 35, to do assignments in UN agencies for 2 years, 3 years. And that's a key entry point for people trying to join the system. But if you have 10 years of experience and you're a technical expert, and this is a generalization, you can go into the system to do a technical job, a consultancy, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, whatever it might be, an urban planner going in to help do the urban plan in Accra in Ghana, for example. And those language requirements are not necessary.
So if I can just clarify,
A WASH specialist, as we say.
a coordinated response to that. I've got recent experience. I'm interested more in the internal systems to actually implement projects. So, for example, not the recruitment, but once a project is ongoing, often there's not a lot of support for the actual field implementation.
That are good at field implementation.
Yeah.
Well, perhaps not directly answering your question, but in terms of delivery and capacity, one of the great failings I felt of WHO in the field is that they would have in any one country at any one time, another generalization, 200 projects. How can you monitor 200 projects? Impossible. Little ones, big ones, you have a limited staff, there are different duration, different people involved, incredibly difficult. I fought hard within my own organisation because most of these programs are going for 5 years. You have a 5-year program of assistance to a country for a budget. If we could do 4 projects and do them well, that would be adequate. So that tells you something about the efficiency of a UN agency. I think the ILO is a very efficient agency, primarily because they have resolutions that are passed by the governing body of the UN, and they're helping countries honour those commitments. And it's a well-run organisation. My own organisation is generally held in high regard, not least because of our mandate, which is a very clear mandate, and not least because 55% of our staff are women. And that makes a huge difference if you're working in the area of maternal and reproductive health.
We have one more question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very quickly, Eloise from the Asia Society. Thanks so much. What a wonderful talk. I suppose this might round out the conversation. We are facing this rise of liberalism globally. We're facing the biggest refugee crisis since the World War II. You know, just for example, the results of the French election and this just move to nationalist tendencies. Is it time for a new system overall? Are we done with the UN? I mean, I've just heard for an hour how inefficient it is.
It's a very fair and it's a very relevant question. I mean, it manifests itself in other ways. The British aid program has just been slashed, enormously slashed, the British aid program. Australia gives about 0.2% in aid. 0.2%. The goal is 0.7%. Only the Norwegians give 1% in aid. The whole question about aid, is there anything else other than the UN? What's going to replace it? There is nothing other than the UN. It will continue. And despite the critics of the UN, and there are many of them, the UN continues to deliver where no one else delivers. No one else was in the camps when I was in the Congo. There was no one else there. There were no bilateral agencies or anybody. There were only us. And you know, I think that's what it does. There's no one else will be providing food aid in Somalia now that they've got starvation there. Only the UN can do that through the World Food Programme. And the UN is the only organisation that has 193 members, that has a General Assembly and has a Security Council. It's far better to have a Security Council than nothing at all. It's far better that someone's talking to the Russian Federation in the UN than not talking to them at all. And it's far better to have the UN debating whether we should go into Iraq or not at all. And they did debate it, albeit we know what happened in Iraq.
Well, thank you for that spirited conclusion. I think most of us here would agree with you in your advocacy for the role of the UN. It's hard to imagine a world without the United Nations playing these important roles. And thank you for this book. I hope people here will buy it and read it. And I know that on an ongoing basis, you are an advocate for the UN and for multilateralism in our community, and a force for good. And it's appreciated by us all here. And thank you very much for doing this.